The morning fog hung thick over Naval Amphibious Base Coronado as Sarah Chen stepped out of the unmarked sedan. Her civilian clothes consisted of simple black slacks, a white button-down shirt, and comfortable flats that wouldn't draw attention. She carried a modest leather briefcase and wore no visible rank insignia or military identifiers. To anyone watching, she looked like just another government contractor or administrative assistant arriving for another routine meeting. The driver, a young Navy petty officer, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Ma'am, I can wait if you'd like. These briefings with the SEAL team sometimes run long." Sarah smiled politely. "That won't be necessary. Thank you for the ride." As she walked toward the imposing concrete building that housed SEAL Team 7's headquarters, Sarah noticed several curious glances from personnel moving about the base. A few junior officers nodded politely, the kind of acknowledgement typically given to civilian support staff. None offered a salute, and Sarah didn't expect one. Her appearance was carefully crafted to blend in, to observe without drawing the attention that her actual position would normally command. Commander Jake Morrison was waiting in the lobby, his desert camouflage uniform crisp, despite the early hour. His weathered face bore the telltale marks of someone who had spent years in harsh environments, and his handshake was firm and brief. "Ms. Chen, I presume? I'm Commander Morrison. Welcome to our humble home." His tone was professional, but carried that slight edge of skepticism that Sarah had encountered countless times before. Military officers, especially those in elite units like the SEALs, were naturally wary of outsiders, particularly civilians who claimed to have insight into their operations. "Thank you, Commander. I appreciate you taking the time for this assessment." Morrison led her through a series of corridors lined with photographs of SEAL operations from decades past. The walls told stories of courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood that could never be fully captured in mere images. Sarah studied them with genuine interest, recognizing several locations from her own operational experience, though she kept these observations to herself. "So, Pentagon sent you to evaluate our readiness protocols?" Morrison asked as they walked. "No offense, but we've had our share of consultants come through here. Most don't really understand what we do." Sarah nodded understandingly. "I imagine that must be frustrating, having outsiders judge your methods without fully grasping the complexities involved." "Exactly." Morrison seemed pleased that she understood his concern. "Don't get me wrong. I'm sure you're good at what you do. Administrative oversight, documentation, that sort of thing. It's important work, but combat operations are different." They entered a conference room where a dozen SEAL operators were seated around a rectangular table. These men represented the pinnacle of military training and conditioning. Each had survived the grueling basic underwater demolition, SEAL training, known as BUD-ES, where only about 20% of candidates successfully complete the program. Their faces showed the confidence that came from knowing they were among the most elite warriors in the world. Morrison gestured to an empty chair at the far end of the table. "Gentlemen, this is Sarah Chen from the Pentagon. She'll be observing our operations review." The introductions were polite but perfunctory. Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, a veteran with over 15 years in the teams, offered a respectful nod. Lieutenant Thompson, who couldn't have been more than 28, seemed curious about her presence. The others acknowledged her with the professional courtesy expected when dealing with civilian oversight personnel. Sarah settled into her chair and opened her briefcase, removing a standard government-issue notepad and pen. She deliberately avoided using any military terminology or displaying knowledge that might seem unusual for a Pentagon administrator. "Please, proceed as you normally would," she said quietly. "I'm here to observe and document, not to interfere." Morrison began the briefing with a detailed overview of their recent training exercises. He discussed small unit tactics, maritime insertion techniques, and close-quarters combat protocols. His presentation was thorough and professional, but Sarah could detect the slight simplification in his explanations, the way he glossed over certain technical aspects that might be too complex for a civilian observer to understand. As the discussion progressed, various team members contributed their perspectives on equipment readiness, personnel training levels, and operational capabilities. Sarah took careful notes, asking occasional clarifying questions that demonstrated her attention to detail without revealing the depth of her actual knowledge. "The new night vision systems have significantly improved our low-light capabilities," reported Lieutenant Thompson. "We've reduced our detection time by approximately 30% during nighttime maritime approaches." Sarah looked up from her notes. "That's impressive. How do those improvements translate to mission success rates in contested environments?" The room fell silent for a moment. It wasn't the type of question they expected from an administrative observer. Morrison raised an eyebrow slightly. That's actually a very good question," Thompson replied. "In our simulated scenarios, we've seen marked improvement in target acquisition and threat identification." Master Chief Rodriguez leaned forward. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what's your background?" "That's pretty specific operational terminology." Sarah maintained her composed demeanor. "I've worked with various military units over the years. You pick up the language after a while." The explanation seemed to satisfy most of the room, though she noticed Rodriguez continued to study her with increased interest. 20-year veterans didn't rise to the rank of Master Chief without developing keen instincts about people. The briefing continued for another 2 hours, covering everything from logistics support to intelligence gathering capabilities. Sarah's questions became increasingly sophisticated, probing into areas that revealed a deep understanding of special operations tactics and strategy. Several team members began to sit up straighter, recognizing that their visitor was far more knowledgeable than she initially appeared. During a break, Morrison approached her privately. "Miss Chen, I have to say, your questions are quite advanced for someone in administrative oversight. What exactly is your role at the Pentagon?" Sarah smiled diplomatically. "I work in special programs evaluation. It requires understanding operational capabilities to properly assess resource allocation and strategic priorities." It was a truthful answer, though incomplete. Morrison seemed to accept it, but she could tell his curiosity was growing. After the break, the discussion shifted to recent operational challenges. Chief Petty Officer Jackson described a complex scenario involving urban warfare tactics in a Middle Eastern environment. His account was detailed and vivid, clearly drawing from real experience rather than training exercises. The key challenge was identifying hostile combatants in a civilian population while maintaining minimum collateral damage protocols, Jackson explained. Our rules of engagement required positive target identification, but the operational environment made that extremely difficult. Sarah set down her pen. "In that type of scenario, did you consider implementing a graduated response protocol with civilian evacuation corridors?" The room fell completely silent. Every eye turned to her. The suggestion she had just made was not something that would occur to most military strategists, let alone a civilian administrator. It demonstrated understanding of both tactical operations and international humanitarian law at a level that came from extensive experience. Morrison's expression shifted noticeably. "That's actually exactly what we ended up doing. How did you know that would be the optimal approach?" Sarah realized she had revealed more than intended. "It seemed like a logical solution given the constraints you described." But Rodriguez was now studying her intently, his experienced eyes taking in details he had missed before. The way she sat, perfectly straight but relaxed. The way her eyes tracked movement around the room, constantly aware of her surroundings. The subtle confidence in her posture that spoke of someone accustomed to command situations. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said slowly, "what branch of service were you in?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah had been asked variations of it countless times over the years, and her answer was always the same. I wasn't military, Chief. I've been a civilian contractor for most of my career. Rodriguez nodded, but his expression remained skeptical. My apologies, ma'am. It's just that you carry yourself like someone who's been there. The observation was accurate, but not something Sarah could acknowledge. Instead, she deflected with a question about their upcoming training schedule, successfully steering the conversation back to safer ground. As the day progressed, Sarah continued to demonstrate knowledge that seemed inconsistent with her supposed background. She understood the intricacies of joint operations coordination, the challenges of multinational task force integration, and the political sensitivities surrounding special operations activities. Each insight drew more curious glances from the SEAL operators. During lunch, eaten in the team's informal dining area, Sarah found herself in conversation with several of the younger operators. They were eager to share their experiences and perspectives, and she listened with genuine interest. Their passion for their mission was evident, as was their dedication to their teammates and their country. Lieutenant Thompson, still intrigued by her earlier questions, sat down beside her. Ms. Chen, I hope you don't mind me saying, but you ask questions like someone who's actually been in the field. Most of the Pentagon folks we get are more concerned with budget numbers and administrative procedures. Sarah smiled. I try to understand the practical implications of policy decisions. It helps me write better reports. What kind of reports do you write? Operational readiness assessments, mostly. Resource allocation recommendations. Strategic capability analyses. Thompson nodded thoughtfully. That must be interesting work. Do you get to visit other units like this? Occasionally. Each unit has its own unique challenges and capabilities. Ever work with other special operations units? Delta Force, Army Special Forces, Marine Raiders? Sarah paused for just a moment before answering. From time to time. The brief hesitation didn't go unnoticed by Thompson, who was trained to pick up on subtle behavioral cues. But before he could pursue the topic further, Morrison called everyone back for the afternoon session. The afternoon focused on equipment evaluation and modernization plans. Sarah's technical knowledge became even more apparent as she discussed the capabilities and limitations of various weapon systems, communication equipment, and specialized gear. Her questions revealed familiarity with equipment specifications that went far beyond what any civilian contractor should possess. Master Chief Rodriguez finally addressed the elephant in the room during a discussion about underwater breathing apparatus. Ma'am, with all due respect, how do you know so much about rebreather systems? That's pretty specialized knowledge, even for someone in your position. Sarah met his gaze steadily. I make it a point to thoroughly research any topic I'm evaluating. Technical specifications are part of that research. Rodriguez nodded slowly, but his expression made it clear he wasn't entirely convinced. Yes, ma'am. It's just unusual to meet someone who understands the practical applications so well without having actually used the equipment. The tension in the room was palpable. These were men trained to read people, to detect deception and hidden agendas. They were beginning to sense that their visitor was not who she appeared to be, but they couldn't quite put their finger on what was different about her. As the day wound down, Morrison walked Sarah back toward the lobby. The fog had lifted and the California sun was setting over the Pacific Ocean, casting long shadows across the base. Ms. Chen, I have to say, this has been one of the most productive evaluation sessions we've had. Your insights were unexpected. Thank you, Commander. Your team is impressive. Their dedication and professionalism are evident. Morrison stopped walking and turned to face her. Can I ask you something off the record? Sarah nodded. You're not really just an administrative evaluator, are you? The question was direct and deserved an honest response, even if not a complete one. I'm exactly what I told you I was, Commander. I evaluate special operations programs for the Pentagon. Sometimes that requires understanding operations from perspectives that might not be immediately obvious. Morrison studied her for a long moment. I spent 12 years as a SEAL operator before taking this command position. I know how to read people, and I know the difference between someone who studies operations and someone who's lived them. You've been in the field. Sarah maintained her professional demeanor. I've spent a lot of time with operational units over the years. You absorb knowledge through exposure. Maybe, Morrison said, but his tone suggested he remained unconvinced. Well, whatever your background, you certainly know your stuff. My men were impressed, and that's not easy to do. They reached the lobby where a different petty officer was waiting to drive her back to the airport. As they shook hands, Morrison made one final observation. You know, Ms. Chen, there's something about the way you carry yourself. It reminds me of the senior officers I've worked with over the years. Officers who've commanded respect in very challenging situations. Sarah smiled politely. That's very kind of you to say, Commander. As she settled into the back seat of the sedan for the ride to the airport, Sarah reflected on the day's events. The evaluation had gone well, and she had gathered the information she needed for her report. But she had also revealed more about herself than was ideal. Rodriguez and Morrison were both experienced enough to recognize that something didn't add up about her background. It was a balancing act she had performed countless times over the years. Gather the information necessary to make informed decisions while maintaining the cover that allowed her to observe units and personnel in their natural environment. The moment people knew who she really was, everything changed. The candid discussions ended, the honest assessments stopped, and the artificial formality began. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her aide back at the Pentagon. Admiral requesting briefing schedule for next week's West Coast visits. Sarah smiled to herself as she typed back a confirmation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve in ways that most people would never know about. But tonight, she was just Sarah Chen, Pentagon administrator, flying back to Washington after a routine evaluation visit. The plane lifted off from San Diego as the sun disappeared completely below the horizon. Sarah opened her laptop and began composing her preliminary assessment of SEAL Team 7's operational readiness. Her report would ultimately help determine resource allocation, training priorities, and mission assignments that could affect the lives of the men she had spent the day with. It was a responsibility she took seriously, just as she had taken seriously every responsibility that had been placed on her shoulders throughout her distinguished career. A career that, for operational security reasons, remained largely invisible to those she evaluated and advised. As the plane climbed toward its cruising altitude, Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The evaluation had been successful, and she had gained valuable insights into one of the Navy's premier special operations units. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she was content with a job well done. 3 weeks later, Sarah found herself on the opposite coast, standing outside the headquarters of the Naval Special Warfare Development Group at Joint Expeditionary Base, Little Creek Fort Story in Virginia. The morning air carried the salt tang of the Chesapeake Bay, and the sound of helicopters conducting training flights echoed across the water. This assignment would prove more challenging than her visit to Coronado. DevGru, often referred to as SEAL Team 6, represented the pinnacle of naval special operations. These operators had been selected from the already elite SEAL teams and put through additional months of specialized training. They were the unit called upon for the most sensitive and dangerous missions, the ones that required absolute precision and complete deniability. Captain Michael Reynolds met her at the security checkpoint. Unlike Commander Morrison's weather-beaten appearance, Reynolds projected the polished professionalism of an officer destined for flag rank. His uniform was impeccable, his bearing confident, and his handshake conveyed the assurance of someone accustomed to high-stakes decision-making. "Ms. Chen, welcome to Little Creek. I trust your flight from Washington was comfortable? Yes, thank you, Captain. I appreciate you accommodating this evaluation on such short notice. Reynolds nodded as they walked toward the main building. When the Pentagon calls requesting a comprehensive assessment, we make it happen. Though I'll admit I'm curious about the timing. We just completed our quarterly readiness review last month. Sarah had anticipated this question. There are some new budgetary considerations being discussed at senior levels. Your unit's unique capabilities make it important to have current data when those decisions are made. It was another carefully crafted truth that revealed nothing about her actual authority or the real reasons behind her visit. Recent intelligence suggested a significant terrorist threat that might require DevGru's specialized skills, but that information remained highly classified, known only to a select few at the highest levels of government. The briefing room at Little Creek differed markedly from the utilitarian conference room at Coronado. Here, secure communication equipment lined one wall, multiple large-screen displays could present classified intelligence in real time, and the furniture was designed to accommodate extended strategic planning sessions. Everything about the environment suggested operations of global significance. The team of operators assembled for her visit represented extraordinary individual achievements. Master Chief Petty Officer David Park had completed more than 200 combat missions across multiple theaters. Lieutenant Commander Susan Walsh was one of the first women to successfully complete the demanding selection process for DevGru. Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Johnson had been decorated for valor in 3 different conflicts. As they settled around the conference table, Sarah noticed the subtle but significant difference in how these operators carried themselves compared to their colleagues at Coronado. There was an additional layer of confidence, bordering on arrogance, that came from knowing they were quite literally the best at what they did. Captain Reynolds opened the session with a detailed briefing on current operational capabilities. His presentation was more sophisticated than Morrison's had been, incorporating classified intelligence assessments and strategic threat analyses that required the highest security clearances to access. Our current deployment cycle maintains teams ready to respond anywhere in the world within 12 hours of notification, Reynolds explained. We've reduced our response time by 18% over the past year through improved logistics coordination and enhanced mission planning protocols. Sarah took notes while simultaneously processing information that related directly to conversations she had participated in at the highest levels of the Pentagon. She had to be careful not to reveal knowledge of classified operations or strategic decisions that hadn't yet been announced to operational commanders. That's an impressive improvement, she observed. How does that enhanced response capability translate to mission effectiveness in complex urban environments? Lieutenant Commander Walsh leaned forward. Ma'am, that's a very specific question. Urban operations present unique challenges that require different metrics for evaluating effectiveness. Sarah nodded. Of course. I'm thinking particularly about scenarios where civilian populations complicate target identification and extraction procedures. The room grew quiet. What Sarah had described wasn't general operational theory. It was a reference to the specific type of mission that DevGru specialized in, missions that were rarely discussed outside of classified planning sessions. Master Chief Park studied her intently. Those scenarios require pre-positioned intelligence assets and extensive coordination with other agencies. The effectiveness metrics are quite different from conventional operations. Exactly, Sarah replied. I imagine the integration challenges are significant when you're working with CIA, FBI, or foreign intelligence services. Captain Reynolds exchanged glances with his senior operators. The woman sitting across from them had just demonstrated knowledge of interagency coordination protocols that were closely guarded secrets, known only to those directly involved in such operations. Ms. Chen, Reynolds said carefully, your questions suggest familiarity with very specialized operational procedures. What exactly is your role in these budget discussions at the Pentagon? Sarah had anticipated this moment would come sooner at Little Creek than it had at Coronado. These operators were more experienced at detecting inconsistencies and more confident about challenging them. "I work in strategic program evaluation," she replied. "The Pentagon requires detailed understanding of operational capabilities to make informed resource allocation decisions." Senior Chief Johnson spoke up for the first time. "Ma'am, with respect, I've briefed Pentagon analysts before. They usually ask about personnel numbers, equipment costs, and training schedules. They don't typically inquire about classified operational procedures." The challenge was direct and deserved a response. Sarah met Johnson's gaze steadily. "Perhaps you've worked with different types of analysts. My evaluations focus on operational effectiveness and strategic impact, which requires understanding how units actually accomplish their missions." Lieutenant Commander Walsh tilted her head slightly. "That makes sense. But it also means you'd need significant security clearances to access the information necessary for that type of analysis." "I have the appropriate clearances for my duties," Sarah replied simply. It was true, though the level of her clearances went far beyond what anyone in the room might expect. But revealing that fact would raise questions she couldn't answer without compromising operational security. The discussion continued for the next several hours, covering advanced tactical procedures, classified equipment capabilities, and strategic mission parameters. Sarah's questions became increasingly sophisticated, revealing knowledge that seemed impossible for someone in her supposed position to possess. During a break, Captain Reynolds approached her privately in the corridor outside the briefing room. "Ms. Chen, I need to ask you directly, who are you really working for?" Sarah maintained her professional demeanor. "I work for the Department of Defense, Captain. Specifically, I'm assigned to the Office of Special Programs Evaluation." "That office reports directly to the Secretary of Defense," Reynolds observed. "Yes, it does." "And you're conducting these evaluations personally rather than sending a team?" "Sometimes personal evaluation is more effective than committee assessment." Reynolds studied her for a long moment. "You know, there's something familiar about you. Have we worked together before?" It was possible. Reynolds had been involved in several high-profile operations over the years, and Sarah's duties had occasionally brought her into contact with DevGru commanders. But she couldn't acknowledge any such previous meetings without revealing more about her background than was advisable. "I don't believe so, Captain. I would remember working with DevGru's commanding officer." Reynolds nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. The afternoon session focused on future capability requirements and modernization priorities. The discussion became highly technical, covering advanced weapons systems, sophisticated communications equipment, and cutting-edge surveillance technologies. Sarah's contributions to these discussions revealed expertise that extended far beyond administrative oversight. The new satellite communication protocols should improve coordination with other special operations units, noted Lieutenant Commander Walsh. But integration with conventional forces remains challenging. Sarah looked up from her notes. "Have you considered implementing a modular communication architecture that allows real-time switching between classified and unclassified networks?" The suggestion was sophisticated enough that Master Chief Park sat back in his chair. "That's actually a very advanced concept. Most communication specialists don't think in terms of modular architecture." "It seems like a logical approach to the interoperability challenges you've described," Sarah replied. Senior Chief Johnson leaned forward. "Ma'am, that kind of system design requires understanding classified communication protocols at a very high level. How are you familiar with those specifications?" Sarah paused for a moment, recognizing that she had once again revealed more expertise than her cover story could easily explain. "I've reviewed various technical proposals as part of my evaluation duties. Sometimes solutions become apparent when you examine multiple approaches to similar problems." The explanation was plausible, but she could see skepticism growing in the eyes of the experienced operators around the table. These men and women had spent their careers in environments where the ability to detect deception could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Captain Reynolds decided to test her knowledge more directly. Since you're evaluating our capabilities, perhaps you could share your assessment of how we compare to our international counterparts: British SAS, German GSG-9, Israeli Shayatet 13? The question was designed to reveal whether Sarah's knowledge extended beyond American special operations. Her answer would indicate whether she was truly the administrative evaluator she claimed to be, or something more significant. Sarah considered her response carefully. Each unit has developed capabilities optimized for their specific strategic requirements and operational environments. Direct comparisons can be misleading without understanding the context of their missions and the resources available to support them. That's a diplomatic answer, Reynolds observed. But what about specific tactical capabilities? Have you had the opportunity to observe other units in action? The question was getting dangerously close to areas Sarah couldn't discuss without compromising operational security. Several of the international units Reynolds had mentioned were close allies with whom she had worked directly on sensitive operations. I've reviewed after-action reports and capability assessments from various sources, she replied carefully. But direct observation of foreign units raises obvious security and diplomatic considerations. Lieutenant Commander Walsh studied her intently. You're very careful about how you phrase your answers, Ms. Chen. That's unusual for someone in an administrative position. The observation was accurate and concerning. Sarah realized that her years of operational experience were showing through despite her efforts to maintain her cover. The language patterns, the careful responses, and the way she processed information all reflected training and experience that civilian analysts typically didn't possess. I've learned to be precise in my communications, Sarah replied. Misunderstandings in government work can have serious consequences. Master Chief Park nodded thoughtfully. Yes, they can. Especially when you're dealing with classified information and sensitive operations. The comment carried an undertone that suggested Park was beginning to suspect that Sarah's access to classified information went far beyond what she had acknowledged. His experience had taught him to recognize the signs of someone operating under cover, even friendly cover designed to facilitate legitimate government business. As the day progressed, the challenges continued to mount. Sarah's technical knowledge, strategic insights, and operational understanding repeatedly exceeded what would be expected from a Pentagon administrator. Each time she demonstrated expertise that seemed inconsistent with her supposed background, the suspicion in the room grew stronger. During the final briefing session, Captain Reynolds addressed the elephant in the room directly. Ms. Chen, my team and I have been having some informal discussions during our breaks today. We're all experienced operators, and we've learned to trust our instincts about people. Our instincts are telling us that you're not who you appear to be. Sarah looked around the table at the faces of some of America's most elite warriors. Their expressions were serious but not hostile. They were seeking truth, not confrontation. I'm exactly who I told you I was, Captain. I'm Sarah Chen, and I work for the Pentagon in program evaluation. That may be true, Reynolds acknowledged, but it's not the complete truth, is it? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah had faced similar moments throughout her career, times when maintaining operational security required walking a fine line between truth and deception. The complete truth about anyone's background and responsibilities can be quite complex in government work, she replied diplomatically. I'm here to conduct an evaluation that will help senior leadership make important decisions about your unit's future. That's the truth that matters for our purposes today. Senior Chief Johnson leaned back in his chair. Fair enough, ma'am. But just so you know, we've all worked with Pentagon types before, and you're different. You ask questions like someone who's been there and done that, not someone who's read about it in reports. Lieutenant Commander Walsh added. And you respond to tactical discussions like someone who's actually planned and executed operations, not someone who's evaluated them from a distance. Sarah appreciated their directness and decided to acknowledge their observations without revealing information she couldn't share. I've had the privilege of working closely with operational units throughout my career. That experience has taught me to ask better questions and understand the practical implications of policy decisions. If that makes me different from other evaluators you've worked with, I consider it a compliment. The answer seemed to satisfy the immediate tension in the room, though Sarah could see that questions remained in their minds. Captain Reynolds nodded and moved the discussion back to operational matters, but she noticed that the team's demeanor had shifted. They were now treating her less like an outside observer and more like a peer, someone whose opinion carried weight beyond mere administrative authority. As the day concluded, Master Chief Park approached her privately. Ma'am, I don't know what your real story is, and I'm not asking you to tell me, but I want you to know that whatever report you write about us, we respect the fact that you took the time to really understand what we do. Most evaluators just check boxes and move on. Sarah was touched by the comment. Thank you, Chief. Your unit's capabilities are impressive and the dedication of your people is evident. That will be reflected in my assessment. Park nodded and extended his hand. As they shook hands, he made one final observation. You know, ma'am, the way you carry yourself reminds me of someone I worked with a few years ago, someone who commanded a lot of respect in very difficult situations. I can't quite place where I might have seen you before, but the feeling is strong. Sarah smiled politely while internally noting the concern. If Park remembered her from a previous operation, it could complicate her ability to maintain her current cover identity. I meet a lot of people in my work, Chief. Perhaps our paths crossed at some briefing or conference. Maybe so, Park replied, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by the explanation. As Sarah prepared to leave Little Creek, she reflected on the challenges of the day. The evaluation had been successful in gathering the information she needed, but it had also revealed the inherent difficulties of maintaining cover among highly trained professionals whose survival depended on their ability to read people accurately. The ride to Norfolk International Airport gave her time to organize her thoughts and plan her approach for the final phase of her evaluation tour. Tomorrow would bring the greatest challenge yet, a visit to a joint task force where multiple special operations units work together, creating an environment where someone might recognize her despite her carefully maintained disguise. Her phone buzzed with a message from her aide. Admiral's office requesting update on evaluation schedule. VIP visit confirmed for Friday. Sarah smiled as she typed a brief acknowledgement. Friday's visit would change everything, but for now, she remained Sarah Chen, Pentagon evaluator, flying back to Washington after another routine assessment visit. The plane lifted off into the darkening Virginia sky, carrying her toward whatever challenges the next phase of her mission would bring. The morning of the Joint Task Force evaluation at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, Florida, dawned clear and humid. Sarah stood outside the headquarters of Special Operations Command, watching the controlled chaos of military personnel from multiple services moving with purpose across the sprawling installation. Today's assessment would involve representatives from Navy SEALs, Army Special Forces, Marine Raiders, and Air Force Special Operations, all working together under the unified command structure that had evolved over decades of joint operations. This final evaluation carried special significance beyond Sarah's official assessment duties. Intelligence reports had identified a critical national security threat that would require unprecedented coordination between special operations units. Her recommendations would directly influence decisions that could affect thousands of lives and the safety of American interests worldwide. Colonel Patricia Martinez greeted her at the main entrance. Unlike the naval officers Sarah had worked with earlier in the week, Martinez projected the crisp efficiency of an Air Force professional tempered by years of special operations experience. Her handshake was firm, her bearing confident, and her eyes held the alertness that came from commanding joint operations in contested environments. "Ms. Chen, welcome to MacDill. I understand you're conducting comprehensive assessments of our special operations capabilities." "Yes, Colonel. Thank you for accommodating this evaluation. I know joint operations present unique coordination challenges." Martinez nodded as they walked through corridors lined with flags representing every military service and dozens of allied nations. "Integration is the key to everything we do here. Individual unit excellence means nothing if we can't work together effectively." The briefing room at Special Operations Command was larger and more sophisticated than either facility Sarah had visited previously. Banks of secure communication equipment connected the room to military commanders worldwide, while multiple large displays could simultaneously present intelligence from various classified sources. The environment reflected the global reach and strategic importance of American special operations capabilities. The assembled personnel represented the elite of each service branch. Navy Commander Lisa Jang had led SEAL teams through multiple combat deployments. Army Lieutenant Colonel James Rodriguez commanded a Special Forces battalion that specialized in unconventional warfare. Marine Major Scott Williams had earned the Silver Star for actions in Afghanistan. Air Force Major Jennifer Park commanded special operations squadrons that conducted the most sensitive insertion and extraction missions. As Sarah settled at the conference table and opened her briefcase, she noticed the familiar pattern of curious glances and polite skepticism. These officers had reached their positions through demonstrated excellence in the most demanding military assignments. They were naturally wary of outside evaluation, particularly from civilians who might not fully understand the complexities of special operations warfare. Colonel Martinez opened the session with a comprehensive briefing on joint special operations capabilities. Her presentation was more sophisticated than anything Sarah had encountered during her previous evaluations, incorporating real-time intelligence assessments, classified operational successes, and strategic capability projections that reflected years of hard-won experience. "Our current joint task force structure allows us to deploy integrated teams anywhere in the world within 6 hours of authorization," Martinez explained. "We've achieved this through standardized procedures, compatible communication systems, and extensive cross-training between service branches." Sarah took careful notes while processing information that related directly to classified briefings she had attended at the highest levels of government. The integration challenges Martinez described were ones Sarah had personally worked to address through policy recommendations and resource allocation decisions. "That's remarkable coordination," Sarah observed. "How do you manage command and control when teams from different services have varying procedures and communication protocols?" Commander Jang looked up with interest. "That's actually one of our most significant ongoing challenges. We've developed hybrid protocols that accommodate service-specific requirements while maintaining operational unity. The key is having experienced officers who understand all service capabilities," added Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez. "Someone who's worked with every type of unit and knows how to optimize their combined effectiveness." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "I imagine that kind of cross-service experience is relatively rare. Most officers spend their careers within their own service branch." "Exactly," Major Williams agreed. "The officers who can truly integrate joint operations are usually those who've had unusual career paths, working directly with multiple services in operational environments." The comment struck closer to home than Williams could have known. Sarah's own career had indeed followed an unusual path, one that had given her direct operational experience with every type of unit represented in the room. As the discussion progressed, Sarah's questions became increasingly sophisticated. She probed into classified operational procedures, interagency coordination protocols, and strategic decision-making processes that revealed knowledge far beyond what any civilian evaluator should possess. "When you're coordinating with CIA or other intelligence agencies," Sarah asked, "how do you handle the inevitable conflicts between operational security and intelligence gathering requirements?" The question brought the room to complete silence. Major Park stared at her with obvious surprise. "Ma'am, that's an extremely specific operational issue. How are you familiar with those types of conflicts?" Sarah realized she had once again revealed more expertise than her cover story could explain. "I've reviewed after-action reports that mentioned coordination challenges between military and intelligence operations." Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez leaned forward. "Those reports are classified at very high levels. Most Pentagon analysts wouldn't have access to the specific details you're referencing." "I have the security clearances necessary for my evaluation duties," Sarah replied, but she could see skepticism growing in every face around the table. Colonel Martinez decided to test Sarah's knowledge more directly. "Since you're evaluating our joint capabilities, perhaps you could share your assessment of how we should adapt to emerging threats. Cyber warfare, space-based assets, autonomous systems?" The question was designed to reveal whether Sarah's knowledge extended to strategic planning at the highest levels of government. Her answer would indicate whether she was truly an administrative evaluator or someone with access to classified strategic assessments. Sarah considered her response carefully. These were areas where she had direct experience and strong opinions, but revealing too much knowledge would compromise her cover completely. "The integration challenges are significant," she replied. "Traditional special operations tactics weren't designed for environments where adversaries have advanced cyber capabilities and space-based surveillance assets. New approaches require rethinking fundamental assumptions about operational security and mission planning." "That's true," Major Williams acknowledged. "But developing those new approaches requires understanding capabilities that most civilians never see. You're talking about classified programs and strategic assessments that are restricted to very senior military leadership." Commander Zhang studied Sarah intently. "Ma'am, I've briefed Pentagon analysts before, and they usually focus on budget numbers and personnel requirements. Your questions suggest you're familiar with operational details that go far beyond administrative oversight." The observation was accurate and concerning. Sarah realized that her years of operational experience were becoming impossible to hide despite her efforts to maintain cover. The language patterns, strategic insights, and technical knowledge all reflected training and experience that civilian evaluators simply didn't possess. "I make it a point to thoroughly understand the operations I'm evaluating," Sarah replied. "Effective assessment requires going beyond surface-level analysis." "That's commendable," Colonel Martinez observed, "but it also suggests you have access to information and briefings that are typically restricted to operational commanders and senior staff officers." Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed with an urgent message. She glanced at the screen and saw a text from her aide. "Admiral arriving early, ETA 30 minutes. Requests immediate briefing upon arrival." Sarah's pulse quickened. Admiral William Patterson's early arrival would accelerate the timeline significantly. She had hoped to complete her evaluation and depart before any senior officials arrived who might recognize her. "Excuse me," she said, looking up from her phone. "I need to make a brief call." Sarah stepped into the corridor and dialed her aide's number. The conversation was brief and conducted in the careful language of classified government communications. "Yes, I understand the Admiral's timeline has changed. No, the evaluation isn't complete yet. Yes, I'll be ready for his briefing upon arrival." When she returned to the conference room, Colonel Martinez was waiting with a concerned expression. "Ms. Chen, I just received word that Admiral Patterson will be joining us shortly. He's conducting a senior leadership assessment of joint special operations capabilities. Sarah's heart sank. Admiral Patterson had specifically requested to meet with the Pentagon evaluator who had been conducting these assessments, not knowing that the evaluator was someone he knew very well in a completely different context. "That's fine, Colonel. I can brief the Admiral on my preliminary findings." Major Park looked puzzled. "Ma'am, Admiral Patterson is pretty senior leadership. It's unusual for flag officers to personally debrief civilian contractors. Sometimes senior officials want first-hand assessments rather than filtered reports," Sarah replied, though she knew the explanation sounded weak. The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of continued briefings and increasingly sophisticated questions from Sarah that revealed expertise no civilian should possess. The assembled officers were clearly beginning to suspect that their visitor was not who she appeared to be. Finally, Colonel Martinez's aide appeared in the doorway. "Ma'am, Admiral Patterson has arrived and is requesting the briefing room be prepared for his assessment." Sarah felt a moment of panic. Once Admiral Patterson saw her, maintaining her cover would become impossible. She had to make a decision about whether to reveal her true identity or attempt to avoid the encounter entirely. "Perhaps I should step aside while the Admiral conducts his assessment," Sarah suggested. "I can complete my evaluation afterward." "Actually," Colonel Martinez replied, "the Admiral specifically requested to meet with the Pentagon evaluator. He wants to coordinate his assessment with your findings." Before Sarah could respond, the conference room door opened and Admiral William Patterson entered, followed by his aide and 2 senior staff officers. Patterson was an imposing figure, his 4 stars gleaming on his collar, his bearing reflecting decades of naval service and command responsibility. He scanned the room briefly, taking in the assembled special operations officers. Then his eyes settled on Sarah. For a moment, his expression showed only mild curiosity as he processed her appearance. Then recognition dawned, and his face showed complete surprise. The room fell silent as Patterson stared at Sarah with obvious shock. Every officer present could see that the Admiral recognized the woman they had assumed was a civilian contractor. "Admiral," Colonel Martinez began, "this is Sarah Chen from the Pentagon. She's been conducting comprehensive evaluations of our special operations capabilities." Patterson continued to stare at Sarah for several more seconds before responding. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a tone of authority that made clear he was addressing someone he knew well. "Colonel Martinez, I need to speak with Ms. Chen privately for a moment." The request sent a wave of confusion through the assembled officers. Why would a 4-star admiral need to privately consult with a civilian contractor? Sarah and Admiral Patterson stepped into a smaller conference room adjacent to the main briefing area. Once the door closed, Patterson's formal demeanor shifted completely. "Admiral Chen," he said quietly, using a title that would have shocked everyone in the other room. "What the hell are you doing here in civilian clothes conducting undercover evaluations?" Sarah had dreaded this moment, but she also felt relief at finally being able to speak freely with someone who knew her true identity. "Bill, I needed to get honest assessments of our special operations capabilities without the artificial responses that come when units know they're being evaluated by flag officers. These evaluations are feeding into critical strategic decisions." Patterson shook his head in amazement. "Sarah, you're a rear admiral in the United States Navy. You command more special operations assets than anyone in this building. Why are you running around pretending to be a civilian contractor?" "Because when I walk into a room as Admiral Chen, people tell me what they think I want to hear. When I walk in as Sarah Chen, Pentagon evaluator, they tell me the truth about their capabilities, their challenges, and their needs." Patterson considered this for a moment. "I suppose that makes sense from an intelligence-gathering perspective. But don't you think these officers deserve to know who they're really dealing with?" They deserve to have their capabilities accurately assessed so they can receive the resources and support they need to accomplish their missions. My personal identity is secondary to that objective." Patterson nodded slowly. "You always were unconventional in your approach to leadership, but you can't maintain this cover much longer. Too many people are starting to ask questions." "I know. Master Chief Rodriguez at Coronado suspects something. Master Chief Park at Little Creek definitely knows I'm not who I claim to be, and this group in there is close to figuring it out completely. So what's your plan?" Sarah sighed. "I was hoping to complete this evaluation and submit my report without having to reveal my identity. But your early arrival has accelerated the timeline." Patterson smiled. "Sorry about that. I got some intelligence briefings this morning that made me want to expedite these assessments." "The same intelligence that prompted my evaluations in the first place?" "Probably. Sarah, these units need to know who's really evaluating them. They're starting to lose trust in the process because they can sense the deception." Sarah knew he was right. The sophisticated questions, the strategic insights, and the operational knowledge had made it impossible to maintain her cover with experienced special operations professionals. "Okay," she said finally. "But I want to finish the briefing as Sarah Chen first. I need their honest assessment of joint operations challenges before they know who I really am." Patterson nodded. "Fair enough. But after that, no more games. They deserve to know they've been briefing a flag officer." They returned to the main briefing room where the assembled officers were clearly speculating about what had just occurred. Their expressions showed curiosity, confusion, and growing suspicion about the mysterious civilian contractor who required private consultation with a four-star admiral. "Gentlemen, ladies," Patterson announced as they resumed their seats, "please continue with your briefing. I'll observe for now and ask questions afterward." The discussion resumed, but the dynamic had changed completely. Every officer in the room was now acutely aware that something unusual was happening. Their responses became more guarded, their observations more careful. Sarah asked several more technical questions about joint operations coordination, receiving answers that confirmed her assessment of the unit's capabilities and limitations. But she could feel the mounting tension as the experienced officers tried to reconcile her sophisticated knowledge with her supposed civilian status. Finally, Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez addressed the issue directly. "Ma'am, I think I speak for everyone here when I say we're confused about what's happening. You ask questions like someone with extensive operational experience, you understand classified procedures that most civilians never see, and now a four-star admiral is personally observing your evaluation. Can you help us understand what's really going on here?" Sarah looked around the table at the faces of some of America's finest military officers. They had served with distinction in the most dangerous assignments their country could offer. They deserved honesty from their leadership. She closed her notepad and looked directly at Rodriguez. "You're right to be confused, Colonel. You're also right that I'm not exactly who I appear to be." The room was completely silent as Sarah reached into her briefcase and withdrew a leather credential case. She placed it on the table in front of her and opened it, revealing the identification that bore her photograph alongside the distinctive insignia of a Rear Admiral in the United States Navy. "My name is Sarah Chen, and I am a Rear Admiral in the United States Navy. I command Naval Special Warfare Group 3, which includes oversight responsibility for many of the units you represent here today." The reaction was immediate and profound. Commander Zhang's eyes widened in shock. Major Williams sat back in his chair as if he had been physically struck. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez stared at the credentials with obvious amazement. Colonel Martinez was the first to find her voice. "Admiral Chen, why didn't you identify yourself when you arrived?" "Because I needed honest assessments of our joint operations capabilities, Colonel. When flag officers conduct evaluations, they often receive carefully scripted responses designed to present units in the best possible light. I needed to understand our actual capabilities and limitations. Major Park leaned forward. Ma'am, you've been asking us questions about our own operations, questions that suggested you already knew the answers. Sarah smiled. I did know many of the answers, Major, but I needed to hear your perspectives on the challenges and opportunities you see in your daily operations. That information is invaluable for strategic planning purposes. Admiral Patterson decided it was time to provide context for Sarah's unusual evaluation method. Ladies and gentlemen, Admiral Chen is conducting these assessments because we're facing potential threats that will require unprecedented coordination between special operations units. Her recommendations will directly influence resource allocation, training priorities, and operational planning at the highest levels of government. Commander Zhang raised her hand tentatively. Admiral, may I ask why you chose this particular approach to evaluation? Sarah considered the question. Commander, in my experience, the most valuable intelligence comes from people who don't know they're being evaluated. When you walk into a briefing room knowing you're presenting to senior leadership, you naturally emphasize successes and minimize problems. When you think you're talking to an administrative evaluator, you're more likely to discuss the real challenges you face. That makes sense, Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez acknowledged. But it must have been difficult to maintain that deception with experienced operators who are trained to detect inconsistencies. It was challenging, Sarah admitted. Master Chief Park at Little Creek came very close to identifying me. Several of you were clearly suspicious by the end of our discussions. Major Williams shook his head in amazement. Admiral, I have to say, your questions were far more sophisticated than anything we've encountered from previous evaluators. Now I understand why. Sarah opened her notepad again. Before we proceed, I want to complete the assessment that brought me here. Now that you know who I am, I need your honest evaluation of one critical question. If you were asked to conduct a complex joint operation requiring coordination between all your units, what would be your greatest concern? The officers exchanged glances. Then Colonel Martinez answered for the group. Admiral, our greatest concern would be command and control in a contested environment. We've trained extensively for joint operations, but most of our experience has been in environments where we had communication superiority and established logistics support. Elaborate on that concern, Colonel. Ma'am, if we're operating in an environment where adversaries have advanced cyber warfare capabilities and can disrupt our communication networks, the coordination protocols we've developed might not be sufficient. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez nodded in agreement. We're also concerned about sustainment operations, Admiral. Joint special operations consume resources at a much higher rate than single-service operations, and our logistics systems aren't optimized for that kind of demand. Commander Zhang added her perspective. From a naval standpoint, Admiral, our biggest concern is extraction capability. If a joint operation goes wrong in a hostile environment, we need to ensure we have redundant methods for getting everyone home. Sarah took careful notes on each observation. These were exactly the kinds of honest assessments she had hoped to obtain through her unconventional evaluation method. Those are all valid concerns, she acknowledged. What recommendations would you make to address them? Major Park responded first. We need more cross-training between service communication specialists, Admiral. Our procedures are compatible, but our personnel need to be comfortable working with unfamiliar equipment and protocols. We also need better integration of our logistics planning, Major Williams suggested. Right now, each service branch handles its own sustainment, which creates inefficiencies and potential failure points. Colonel Martinez offered a broader perspective. Admiral, I think we need regular joint exercises that simulate the kind of contested environment we're most concerned about. Most of our current training assumes friendly airspace and secure communications. Sarah nodded as she finished taking notes. Excellent recommendations. All of them will be incorporated into my final assessment. She closed her notepad and looked around the table at the assembled officers. I want to thank all of you for your patience with my unconventional evaluation method. The insights you've provided today will directly influence strategic decisions that affect your unit's future capabilities. Admiral Patterson stood up, indicating that the formal briefing was concluding. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just participated in one of the most comprehensive special operations assessments ever conducted. Admiral Chen's recommendations will be presented directly to the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. As the officers began to stand, Colonel Martinez addressed Sarah directly. Admiral, speaking for everyone here, we're honored to have had this opportunity to brief you directly. Your approach was unorthodox, but it demonstrated respect for our professional opinions and genuine interest in our operational perspectives. Sarah smiled. Thank you, Colonel. I learned as much from your questions as you did from mine. As the formal briefing concluded and officers began filing out of the room, Master Chief Park approached Sarah privately. Admiral, I knew there was something different about you from the beginning. You carried yourself like someone who had commanded respect in very challenging situations. Thank you, Chief. Your instincts were correct. Ma'am, can I ask you something? Why is a Rear Admiral personally conducting these evaluations? This seems like something that could have been delegated to staff officers. Sarah considered how much she could reveal. Chief, sometimes the most important decisions require personal assessment rather than filtered reports. The intelligence that prompted these evaluations suggests we may need to deploy Joint Special Operations units in ways we've never attempted before. Park nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. I understand. As the room emptied, Admiral Patterson remained behind with Sarah. That went better than I expected, he observed. They took the revelation well. They're professionals, Bill. Once they understood the reasoning behind the deception, they focused on the mission. Patterson smiled. You always did have unusual methods, Sarah. But I have to admit, the intelligence you've gathered through this process is far more valuable than what we would have obtained through conventional evaluations. Sarah began packing her briefcase. The written assessment will be on your desk by Monday morning. But I can tell you now that these units are capable of conducting the joint operations we're contemplating. They've identified the right concerns and developed sound recommendations for addressing them. That's exactly what I hope to hear. As they walked toward the exit, Patterson made one final observation. You know, Sarah, word of this evaluation method is going to spread throughout the special operations community. You probably won't be able to use this approach again. Sarah laughed. Probably not. But it was effective while it lasted. They reached the lobby where Sarah's transportation was waiting. As they shook hands, Admiral Patterson offered a final thought. Admiral Chen, it's been an honor working with you on this assessment. Your dedication to getting honest evaluations despite the personal challenges involved demonstrates the kind of leadership our special operations units deserve. Thank you, Bill. That means a great deal coming from you. As Sarah settled into the back seat of the sedan for the ride to the airport, she reflected on the events of the past week. The evaluations had been successful beyond her expectations. She had gathered detailed intelligence on the capabilities and limitations of America's most elite military units. Intelligence that would directly influence critical strategic decisions in the weeks and months ahead. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her aide. Secure briefing scheduled with SecDef tomorrow at 800. Joint Chiefs briefing at 1000. Sarah smiled as she typed a brief acknowledgement. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new responsibilities, but tonight she was satisfied with a mission accomplished. The plane lifted off from Tampa as the sun set over the Gulf of Mexico. Sarah opened her laptop and began drafting the executive summary that would accompany her detailed assessment reports. Her recommendations would help shape the future of American Special Operations capabilities. ensuring that the brave men and women she had met over the past week would have the resources and support necessary to accomplish whatever missions their country might ask of them. As the aircraft climbed toward its cruising altitude, Rear Admiral Sarah Chen allowed herself a moment of professional satisfaction. The unconventional evaluation had succeeded in ways that traditional assessment methods never could have achieved. She had honored both the trust placed in her by senior leadership and the dedication demonstrated by the special operations professionals who served under her command. It had been a successful mission by any measure, and tomorrow would bring new opportunities to serve her country in whatever capacity was required.